Dr. Aaron Blake was nearing the end of a long shift at St. Mark's Medical Center when the call came in. The charge nurse's voice over the intercom was urgent, almost strained, and that told him everything he needed to know. There was a critical case coming in, and he was the only surgeon available with the experience needed to handle it. As he rushed down the hallway toward the emergency room, Aaron focused on the immediate task at hand, pushing aside the exhaustion that lingered from his previous back-to-back surgeries. When he arrived, the scene was chaotic. Nurses moved swiftly, IVs were being prepared, and medical technicians were shouting out stats from the monitors. Greg Sanders, a trusted colleague and emergency room physician, was at the center of the storm. He caught sight of Aaron and immediately began relaying information. "Middle-aged female, extensive internal bleeding from a car accident," Greg said, his voice steady but brisk. "Her vitals are weak, but we've stabilized her enough for surgery. We've identified the main sources of bleeding, but it's going to be tricky." Aaron nodded, absorbing the details. Years of experience kicked in as he scanned the monitors and quickly reviewed the patient's chart that had just been printed. Her name, Margaret Cooper. The accident had left her with multiple injuries, and she was in critical condition. As Greg continued, Aaron's thoughts honed in on the most pressing issue. There was a window of time, narrow but achievable, to save this woman's life. With the team prepped and the OR ready, Aaron changed into surgical scrubs and entered the operating room. There, amid the hum of machines and the focused intensity of the staff, Aaron found his zone. The procedure was going to be intricate, involving delicate maneuvering to repair internal organs without triggering further complications. Aaron's steady hands and keen surgical intuition were exactly what the moment called for. The minutes felt like hours, and Aaron's eyes remained fixed on the patient, his focus unwavering. Despite a few unforeseen complications, Aaron methodically navigated through the operation. He called for extra sutures, made adjustments, and communicated clearly with his team, who worked in perfect sync under his direction. Aaron's competence wasn't just the product of rigorous training. It was the result of years spent fighting for respect and recognition in a profession where the biases of others often dictated perceptions of his skill. Finally, after hours that seemed both unending and fleeting, the operation was complete. Margaret Cooper's vitals were stabilizing, and the bleeding had been controlled. Aaron took a moment to breathe, feeling the fatigue wash over him now that the immediate crisis was over. He removed his surgical mask and exchanged relieved glances with his team. They had done their job. Margaret Cooper was going to live. Aaron left the OR, changed back into his white coat, and took a few moments to mentally transition back to the reality of the hospital outside. He knew it was only a matter of time before the patient woke up, and he needed to be there to brief her on the surgery and her current condition. It was a routine part of his job, but one that required finesse, as people waking from surgery could often be disoriented, emotional, or even combative. What Aaron wasn't prepared for, however, was the reaction he was about to encounter. As Margaret Cooper regained consciousness in the recovery room, Aaron approached her bedside with a reassuring smile. He introduced himself and began explaining the surgery in clear, concise terms. Margaret, still groggy from the anesthesia, listened in silence at first. But as her awareness sharpened, her expression shifted. She turned to Aaron with a look of cold hostility that took him slightly off guard. "What are you doing here?" Margaret's voice, strained but laced with bitterness, cut through the professional atmosphere Aaron had maintained. "Mrs. Cooper, I'm Dr. Blake. I performed your surgery and—" Aaron began, but Margaret interrupted. "I want another doctor. I don't want you treating me," she snapped, her voice growing louder. Aaron stood in silence for a moment, processing her words. It wasn't the first time a patient had reacted this way upon realizing he was their doctor, and unfortunately, he knew it wouldn't be the last. "Mrs. Cooper, I assure you," Aaron started again, keeping his voice even and professional. But Margaret cut him off once more. "I don't want assurances from you," she spat. Her eyes narrowed with suspicion and anger, flicked up and down, taking in Aaron's appearance as if it were something offensive. "You people shouldn't be doctors," she muttered under her breath, barely audible but clear enough to be understood. Aaron took a slow breath, steadying himself. This wasn't new to him, but it never got easier. He was used to the looks, the veiled questions about his credentials, the assumptions that came not from his competence, but from his skin color. Still, every encounter felt like an unspoken trial where he had to prove himself all over again. He reminded himself of his commitment to his patients, of his oath, and most importantly, of his integrity. He continued explaining the post-operative care and the steps that would follow, keeping his tone measured and clear. Margaret continued to glare at him, her words growing harsher with every interaction. She was clearly unhappy with the situation, and Aaron could see the gears turning in her head as she began piecing together the narrative she wanted to construct. Margaret's outbursts were growing louder, catching the attention of nearby nurses and other patients in the recovery room. A few nurses attempted to intervene, but Aaron signaled them to hold back. "Mrs. Cooper," he said gently but firmly, "I understand that you've been through a lot today, and emotions are running high. But I am here to ensure you recover safely. That is my only priority." "Don't patronize me," Margaret shot back. "I'll have you fired for this." At this point, Dr. Susan Long, who had been notified of the disturbance, entered the room. Susan was the kind of person whose presence commanded respect, not through authority, but through empathy and experience. She had seen this happen before and knew how to de-escalate the situation. As she approached Margaret, she nodded subtly to Aaron, letting him know she had it under control. "Margaret," Susan said, her voice calm and steady, "Dr. Blake has been overseeing your care, and I trust him completely. He's one of the best surgeons we have." Margaret's eyes darted between Susan and Aaron, still seething, but sensing she had no immediate allies in the room. She turned her head away in silent defiance, and Susan took that as a sign to steer the conversation toward Margaret's post-operative care. Aaron stayed for a moment longer, in case he was needed, before quietly stepping out of the room. He could feel the tension hanging in the air, but there was nothing more to be said at that moment. As Aaron made his way down the hallway, his mind was buzzing. He knew that this was only the beginning of what could become a much larger issue. He wasn't naive. He had seen how complaints, even unfounded ones, could spiral out of control, especially when fueled by prejudice. And Margaret Cooper's hostility was clear. It wasn't about his qualifications, his professionalism, or even the outcome of the surgery. It was about the fact that he didn't fit the image of the doctor she believed should be caring for her. Aaron couldn't shake the frustration, but he wouldn't let it show. He had built a career on being calm under pressure, on rising above the ignorance and hostility he encountered. He would have to lean on those skills now more than ever. The tension that had begun in the recovery room did not dissipate in the days that followed. Margaret Cooper's anger only intensified, fueled by indignation and resentment. From her hospital bed, she demanded repeatedly to see a different doctor, insisting that Dr. Aaron Blake had compromised her care. Despite being informed by Dr. Susan Lang and other senior staff members that Aaron was a highly qualified surgeon who had saved her life, Margaret remained unmoved, resolute in her conviction that something had gone horribly wrong simply because of who had performed the operation. What began as an uncomfortable exchange in the recovery room quickly escalated into something much larger. Margaret's accusations weren't contained to private conversations between her and the medical staff. She spoke loudly and persistently, making her displeasure known to anyone who would listen. Word of her dissatisfaction spread through the hospital corridors, reaching the ears of staff, patients, and eventually the administration. Aaron, who continued his rounds and attended to other patients, tried to stay focused on his work, but the murmurs in the hallways and the sideways glances from some of the staff were impossible to ignore. News of a patient's dissatisfaction wasn't uncommon in a large medical center, but Margaret Cooper wasn't just unhappy. She was actively questioning Aaron's competence and ethics based on racial biases. Aaron's years of dedication and impeccable record seemed to hold little weight in the eyes of someone so determined to find fault. The day after the initial outburst, Margaret requested a meeting with Dr. Susan Lang. She expressed her grievances with unmistakable bitterness, citing Aaron's race as the basis of her discomfort. She questioned his qualifications, despite seeing the degrees and certifications prominently displayed in his office. She insinuated that Aaron's position must have been a result of affirmative action rather than merit. Susan listened patiently, maintaining a professional demeanor, but beneath her composed exterior, she felt a growing anger on Aaron's behalf. "Mrs. Cooper," Susan began calmly after Margaret had finished her tirade, "I assure you that Dr. Blake is not only fully qualified, but one of the most skilled surgeons on our staff. The decision to assign him to your case was based on his expertise and experience, nothing else." Margaret's lips tightened into a thin line. "I don't want him near me," she hissed. "I want a doctor I can trust." "Trust is essential, Mrs. Cooper," Susan replied, her tone firm but measured. "But trust is built on facts and actions, not assumptions. Dr. Blake performed a complex surgery that saved your life, and for that, I would expect some level of gratitude." Margaret scoffed, but Susan continued, unwilling to let the matter slide. "This hospital does not tolerate discrimination of any kind. I strongly advise you to reconsider your stance." Margaret's eyes narrowed, and her voice dropped to a whisper. "You think you can lecture me?" she spat. "I'll ruin him, you'll see." Margaret's threat wasn't an idle one. Over the next few days, she escalated her complaints, transforming her grievances into a campaign. She began speaking to other patients and their families, spinning a narrative of incompetence and mistreatment. Aaron's race became the undercurrent of every insinuation she made, although she often cloaked her prejudice in vague concerns about professionalism or quality of care. She spoke to hospital administrators, insinuating that Aaron's medical decisions had put her life at risk. Her allegations, though unfounded, began to carry weight simply by being repeated. Aaron, who was accustomed to working under pressure, found himself facing an entirely different kind of stress. He had encountered prejudice before, but Margaret Cooper's persistence was different. Her words were finding sympathetic ears among those already predisposed to doubt him, and the rumors she spread were creating a toxic atmosphere within the hospital. He kept his head down and continued his work, but the whispers followed him everywhere he went. Nurses exchanged knowing looks when he walked by. Patients who had once greeted him warmly now seemed hesitant, and a few colleagues began avoiding eye contact. Though he had the support of Susan Lang and Greg Sanders, Aaron knew that support alone wouldn't shield him from the ripple effects of Margaret's accusations. Prejudice, when articulated as concern, could be insidiously persuasive. It wasn't long before Margaret's complaints reached the hospital's legal team. Despite there being no evidence to substantiate her claims, the legal department had to take the matter seriously. Dr. Lang met with Aaron privately, updating him on the growing list of complaints Margaret had filed. She was apologetic, expressing her frustration and disbelief at how quickly the situation had escalated. "Aaron," Susan said, her voice tinged with both anger and concern, "this is getting out of hand. We have your records, your colleagues' testimonials, and the data from the surgery, all of which prove you did everything right. But Margaret's complaints aren't just about medical issues. They're personal. She's trying to turn this into a character attack." Aaron sighed, rubbing the back of his neck, feeling the weight of the accusations settle like a heavy cloak over his shoulders. He had been through challenges before, but this felt different. It felt relentless. "I've done everything by the book, Susan," he replied quietly. "But sometimes, doing things right doesn't matter to people who've already made up their minds." Susan leaned back in her chair, her expression contemplative. "We're standing by you, Aaron. You have the full support of this hospital," she assured him. "But I'm worried about what happens if this goes beyond these walls." That concern turned out to be well-founded. Margaret's anger had not only reached the hospital's administration, but had also spread to social media, where she began making vague, incendiary posts about her horrible experience at St. Mark's. Without naming Aaron explicitly, she made it clear that her dissatisfaction was tied to the doctor's lack of professionalism and made insinuations that hinted at racial undertones. Her words were echoed by a handful of others who were all too willing to find fault where none existed. The hospital's public relations team took notice, and soon Aaron was summoned for a meeting with legal counsel to discuss the ramifications. Greg Sanders, ever the loyal friend, met with Aaron after the news broke. Greg, who had been friends with Aaron since their residency days, knew how hard his colleague had worked to earn his position. He saw the toll this was taking on Aaron, and it infuriated him. "This is ridiculous," Greg said, pacing the room in frustration. "You did your job, you saved her life, and now this? It's infuriating how some people just can't accept that you belong here." Aaron appreciated Greg's support, but he was too tired to feel anything other than numb. "It's not new," Aaron replied with a weary smile, "but it's exhausting." Susan joined them, looking as though she hadn't slept in days. She placed a comforting hand on Aaron's shoulder. "We're going to fight this," she said firmly. "We have all the evidence to prove her claims are baseless. I've spoken to the board, and they're standing behind you." But Margaret Cooper wasn't done yet. She filed a formal legal complaint against Aaron in the hospital, demanding action. She accused Aaron of negligence and implied that his race had influenced his competence. In her view, Aaron's existence as a black doctor was an anomaly, and therefore he couldn't possibly be as capable as his colleagues. Aaron's world, once so neatly defined by the hours spent saving lives and making a difference, now felt like a battlefield. He continued to show up, to provide the best care he could to all his patients, even as his mind churned with worry. He could sense the unease among his colleagues, some of whom offered words of support, while others maintained a cautious distance. The weight of the accusations hung over him like a shadow, turning even routine interactions into moments of silent judgment. There were moments when the exhaustion nearly overwhelmed him. Aaron found himself waking up in the middle of the night, unable to shake the fear that all his years of hard work and sacrifice could be unraveled by one person's prejudice. He wasn't afraid of losing his job. He was afraid of losing everything he had built: his reputation, his integrity, and his ability to make a difference in the lives of his patients. Through it all, Aaron remained committed to his work, even as Margaret's hostility and the threat of legal action continued to escalate. He saw other patients with the same care and compassion as he always had, though there was a lingering tension in his interactions. He knew that even the smallest mistake, the slightest slip, could be twisted into something more sinister in the eyes of those who were already inclined to believe Margaret's narrative. The hospital became a minefield of whispered conversations and cautious glances, each step a careful calculation to maintain the appearance of normalcy. But beneath the surface, there was a simmering tension, an unspoken acknowledgement of the battle being waged. Aaron had fought many battles in his career, but this one was different. It was insidious and exhausting, and it was one he hadn't asked for. Aaron, ever the professional, kept his composure. But inside, he was tired. Tired of having to prove himself over and over again. Tired of the subtle and not-so-subtle ways people questioned his capabilities. And tired of being judged not by the quality of his work, but by the color of his skin. In those quiet moments between surgeries, when he found himself alone in the break room or standing at the window looking out over the city, Aaron allowed himself to acknowledge the exhaustion. But he also reminded himself of why he had chosen this path in the first place: to save lives, to make a difference, and to stand as a testament to those who came before him, who had fought even harder battles. Even as Margaret's threats grew louder and the legal proceedings loomed, Aaron resolved to keep moving forward. He wasn't just fighting for himself, he was fighting for every young doctor of color who would come after him, who deserved to walk these halls without fear of judgment or prejudice. And that resolve, though tested daily, was something Margaret Cooper could never take from him. The atmosphere at St. Mark's Medical Center had shifted palpably in the wake of Margaret Cooper's escalating accusations. What had begun as a bitter verbal exchange in the recovery room had now taken on a much more serious tone. Margaret's formal complaint against Dr. Aaron Blake not only questioned his medical competence, but also insinuated that his racial identity had somehow made him unfit to perform his duties. For Aaron, this was no longer just an interpersonal conflict. It was a legal and reputational battle that threatened to undermine everything he had worked so hard to achieve. It wasn't long before Aaron found himself sitting in a conference room with the hospital's legal counsel, a stern-faced attorney named Samuel Peters, and Dr. Susan Lang. The legal team had convened to discuss Margaret's allegations, which had now culminated in a lawsuit accusing Aaron of medical negligence. and the hospital of failing to provide adequate oversight. As Samuel flipped through a thick file of legal documents, the tension in the room was palpable. The stakes had never felt higher. "Dr. Blake," Samuel began, his voice even and deliberate, "the allegations Mrs. Cooper has made are very serious. She's claiming that your actions during the surgery were reckless and that you intentionally disregarded her well-being. She's also implying that there was racial bias involved in your decision-making." Aaron listened in silence, letting the weight of Samuel's words settle over him. It was one thing to be accused of negligence, something that could be disproven with facts and evidence. But to be accused of acting with malicious intent based on racial prejudice was something altogether different. It was an accusation that attacked not just his professionalism, but his character and integrity. "What exactly is her evidence?" Aaron asked, his voice steady but strained. He knew the answer, but he needed to hear it said out loud, needed to confront the absurdity head-on. Samuel sighed, a tired sound that conveyed both frustration and sympathy. "There isn't any," he replied, "but that's the problem with allegations like these. It's not about what's true, it's about what people are willing to believe. She's framing this as a case of gross incompetence and discriminatory intent, and her claims are vague enough to cause real damage if they aren't addressed properly." Susan, who had been sitting quietly with her arms crossed, leaned forward. "We have Aaron's track record, his credentials, the surgery reports, and testimonies from multiple staff members. We can prove beyond a doubt that he acted with the highest level of professionalism," she insisted, her voice firm. "Yes," Samuel agreed, "but Mrs. Cooper has a narrative, and narratives are powerful, especially when they play into pre-existing biases. Our goal isn't just to win this case, it's to dismantle that narrative piece by piece." Over the following weeks, the hospital's legal team worked tirelessly to build their defense. They gathered medical records, analyzed video footage from the operating room, and interviewed staff members who had been present during Margaret's surgery and recovery. Susan and Greg Sanders both gave detailed statements in support of Aaron, emphasizing his professionalism and the successful outcome of the surgery. The team prepared to challenge every aspect of Margaret's complaint, from her claims of negligence to her baseless insinuations of racial bias. As the legal proceedings began to unfold, Aaron found himself thrust into the public eye in a way he had never anticipated. Margaret's lawsuit had garnered media attention, and local news outlets picked up the story, framing it as a controversial case of alleged medical malpractice and racial discrimination. Reporters camped outside the hospital, eager for a statement from either side. The hospital's PR team released carefully worded statements defending Aaron and emphasizing the institution's commitment to diversity and excellence. But the damage was already done. In the court of public opinion, perception often held more weight than facts. Inside the courtroom, the air was thick with anticipation. Margaret Cooper's legal team had spared no effort in crafting their case. Her lawyer, a man named David Crawley, had a reputation for being aggressive and unrelenting, and he wasted no time in presenting Margaret's version of events. Crawley painted a picture of a frightened, vulnerable woman who had been placed in the hands of an allegedly inexperienced doctor. He portrayed Margaret as a victim of an indifferent medical system that had failed to protect her, and Aaron as a reckless practitioner driven by a misguided sense of superiority. Margaret took the stand, recounting her story with an air of wounded dignity. She described feeling unheard and unsafe, using a language that was carefully chosen to evoke sympathy and outrage. She spoke about how she had requested another doctor, only to be ignored. Her lawyer made subtle but pointed references to the disparity between her expectations and the reality she had been confronted with, letting the implication of racial discomfort linger without ever stating it outright. When it was Aaron's turn to testify, he did so with the same calm professionalism that had defined his career. He spoke clearly and methodically, detailing the events of the surgery and the decisions he had made. He explained the challenges of the procedure and emphasized the steps he had taken to ensure Margaret's safety. Throughout his testimony, Aaron never wavered, even as Crawley attempted to provoke him with insinuations about his qualifications and motivations. Aaron's years of experience had taught him how to maintain his composure under pressure, and he relied on that experience now more than ever. The hospital's legal team, led by Samuel Peters, methodically dismantled Margaret's claims. They presented medical records, surgery reports, and testimonies from staff members who had witnessed the operation. They pointed out inconsistencies in Margaret's statements and highlighted the success of the surgery, which had ultimately saved her life. Susan Lang and Greg Sanders both took the stand to vouch for Aaron's competence and dedication, emphasizing the respect he commanded among his colleagues. As the trial progressed, it became clear that Margaret's accusations were built on a foundation of personal bias and unfounded assumptions. The hospital's legal team revealed the true nature of Margaret's complaints, exposing them as the result of prejudice rather than genuine concern for her health. The turning point came when the hospital's lawyer introduced video footage from the operating room, which showed Aaron working diligently and professionally to save Margaret's life. The footage left little room for doubt, and it was a decisive blow to Margaret's case. When the time came for closing arguments, Samuel Peters addressed the jury with quiet conviction. He spoke not only about the facts of the case, but about the importance of integrity and truth in a world where bias could so easily cloud judgment. He asked the jury to consider the implications of allowing unfounded accusations to damage the career of a dedicated professional, and to remember that narratives, while powerful, were not always rooted in reality. The jury deliberated for what felt like an eternity, but in the end they reached a unanimous verdict. The case against Aaron was dismissed, and Margaret Cooper's claims were deemed without merit. The courtroom erupted in a flurry of whispered conversations and relieved sighs, but Aaron remained silent, absorbing the reality of what had just happened. He had been vindicated, but the relief was tempered by the emotional toll the experience had taken. Outside the courthouse, reporters clamored for a statement, but Aaron chose to walk quietly to his car, accompanied by Susan and Greg. He knew that while the legal battle was over, the impact of the accusations would linger. It wasn't just about winning a case, it was about reclaiming his sense of security and confidence in a profession he had dedicated his life to. In the days that followed, the hospital administration held a private meeting with Aaron to discuss the outcome of the case and the steps that would be taken moving forward. They expressed their gratitude for his resilience and assured him that his position was secure. But for Aaron, the meeting was bittersweet. He appreciated the support, but he couldn't ignore the underlying reality that prejudice, even when proven baseless, could still leave scars. Aaron took some time away from work to process everything that had happened. He spent quiet days at home, reflecting on the ordeal and its implications. Conversations with Susan and Greg helped him come to terms with the events, but the experience had left him with a deeper understanding of the challenges that still lay ahead. He knew that proving himself would be a continuous journey, not just for himself, but for every young doctor who faced similar biases. When Aaron finally returned to work, he did so with a renewed sense of purpose. The case had been a reminder of why he had chosen this path in the first place: to challenge the status quo, to break down barriers, and to pave the way for others who would follow in his footsteps. He couldn't control the biases of others, but he could control how he responded to them, and that was a power he intended to wield with unwavering resolve. In the weeks that followed, the hospital slowly returned to its normal rhythm, but the impact of the case was still felt in subtle ways. Aaron noticed that some colleagues were more hesitant in their interactions, while others went out of their way to offer words of encouragement and support. He accepted both with quiet grace, understanding that trust, once shaken, took time to rebuild. Through it all, Aaron remained dedicated to his work. He continued to provide the best care he could to his patients, knowing that his actions spoke louder than words. He wasn't just a doctor, he was a symbol of resilience, a testament to the power of perseverance in the face of adversity. And as he walked the halls of St. Mark's, he held his head high, determined to keep moving forward, no matter what challenges lay ahead. The courtroom was silent as the judge's gavel came down, dismissing the case against Dr. Aaron Blake and delivering a definitive statement that the accusations of negligence and discrimination were baseless. In that moment, Aaron felt a mixture of emotions: relief, exhaustion, and the lingering weight of the ordeal. He had been vindicated in the eyes of the law, but the scars from the experience were not something a simple legal victory could erase. As Aaron walked out of the courthouse, surrounded by his legal team and colleagues, The fresh autumn air felt different somehow, lighter and more laden with possibilities. But beneath that sense of closure was an unspoken acknowledgement. Winning the case didn't mean the battle was over. The damage to his reputation, the emotional toll, and the subtle shift in people's perceptions were all still very real. Aaron was met with congratulations and well wishes from those who had supported him through the ordeal. Susan Lang and Greg Sanders were among the first to embrace him. Greg, who had been vocal in his anger and frustration over the accusations, patted Aaron on the back. "You did it, man," he said, trying to inject some levity into his voice. "Not that there was ever any doubt." Aaron smiled, appreciating the attempt, but his eyes held a weariness that spoke volumes. "Yeah," he replied, "we won. Thanks for sticking with me through this." Susan stood quietly for a moment, studying Aaron with a knowing look. She had been his ally and his advocate, not just during the case, but long before it began. "This isn't just about winning in court, Aaron," she said softly. "You've shown everyone what integrity and strength look like, even under the worst circumstances." Aaron nodded, feeling the weight of her words. He knew that the journey didn't end with a courtroom victory. There were still challenges to face, and healing was something that couldn't be rushed. The following days at the hospital were a strange blend of the familiar and the new. There was an air of cautious relief among the staff, but also a lingering tension. Some colleagues approached Aaron with words of support, expressing their admiration for his resilience. Others were more reserved, their interactions tinged with awkwardness, as if unsure how to reconcile their assumptions with the reality of the case's outcome. Aaron accepted it all with grace, understanding that change, even the smallest shifts in perception, took time. One morning as Aaron made his rounds, he found himself face to face with a familiar figure, Margaret Cooper. She was standing near the nurse's station, signing some final discharge papers. When she saw Aaron, her expression hardened, and for a brief moment, neither of them spoke. Aaron held her gaze, his face an unreadable mask of professionalism. There was a part of him that wanted to confront her, to demand an explanation or an apology, but he knew it wouldn't make a difference. Prejudice wasn't something that could be reasoned away in a single conversation. "Mrs. Cooper," Aaron greeted her with a polite nod, maintaining the same calm demeanor he had shown throughout the ordeal. Margaret looked at him for a long moment, as if searching for something to say, but the words never came. Instead, she turned away, signing the last of her papers without another glance in his direction. Aaron watched her walk away, feeling a sense of finality, but not necessarily closure. The case might have ended, but the wounds left behind by Margaret's accusations would take time to heal. That evening, Aaron sat in his office reflecting on everything that had happened. The legal battle had been grueling, but in many ways it was the subtle, unspoken battles that had worn him down the most. The judgment in people's eyes, the quiet whispers in the halls, and the constant need to prove his worth. He knew that this wasn't the first time he had faced prejudice, and it wouldn't be the last. But he also knew that he had come through it stronger and more determined than ever. Greg stopped by Aaron's office, as he often did at the end of the day, and took a seat across from him. "You know," Greg began, "I've been thinking about what all of this means, about how easy it is for people to judge without knowing the whole story. I'm just sorry you had to go through that." Aaron leaned back in his chair, letting Greg's words sink in. "I appreciate that, Greg," he said, his voice thoughtful. "But what matters now is moving forward. It's not about forgetting what happened, but about finding a way to use it, to keep pushing for change, even when it feels impossible." Greg nodded, a look of understanding passing between them. "You know I've got your back," he said, his tone earnest. "Whatever comes next, we'll face it together." Aaron smiled, feeling a sense of solidarity that went beyond words. Having friends like Greg and allies like Susan was a reminder that he wasn't alone in this journey, and that, in itself, was a victory worth holding on to. As the days turned into weeks, Aaron gradually found a new rhythm at the hospital. The case became a distant memory for some, but for Aaron it was a lesson that would stay with him forever. He continued to dedicate himself to his work, driven by a renewed sense of purpose. He saw every patient, every surgery, as an opportunity not just to heal, but to redefine the narrative that had been imposed upon him. One afternoon, Susan invited Aaron to her office for a private conversation. She had been his staunchest ally throughout the ordeal, and he valued her perspective more than anyone's. As they sat down, Susan looked at Aaron with a thoughtful expression. "I've been thinking about what all of this means for the hospital," she said, echoing Greg's earlier sentiment. "We need to do more than just defend against accusations like Margaret's. We need to actively address the biases that allow these situations to arise in the first place." Aaron listened, intrigued. He had always respected Susan's forward-thinking approach, and he knew she wasn't someone who simply talked about change. She acted on it. "I want to start a new initiative," Susan continued, "a program that focuses on diversity and inclusion, not just in hiring, but in creating a culture of accountability and respect. And I'd like you to help lead it." Aaron felt a swell of emotion at Susan's words. This was more than just a gesture of support. It was an opportunity to make a real impact, to turn his experience into something meaningful. "I'd be honored," he replied, his voice steady with determination. "If my experience can help make a difference, then it's worth it." Over the next few months, Aaron and Susan worked together to develop the program, which aimed to provide training, resources, and support for both staff and patients. They held workshops on unconscious bias, created spaces for open dialogue, and implemented new policies to ensure that incidents of discrimination were addressed swiftly and transparently. It wasn't an easy task, and there were moments of resistance, but Aaron remained committed to the cause. He had faced the consequences of prejudice firsthand, and he was determined to prevent others from enduring the same. In time, the program began to take root, slowly transforming the culture of the hospital. Aaron noticed subtle changes in the way his colleagues interacted, in the way staff approached their work, and in the way patients were treated. It wasn't a complete transformation. Change was never that simple, but it was a step in the right direction. And that, Aaron knew, was how progress was made, one step at a time. As Aaron walked through the halls of St. Mark's one evening, he paused to look out the window at the city skyline. The sun was setting, casting a warm golden light over the buildings. It was a moment of quiet reflection, a chance to breathe and take in how far he had come. He thought about the challenges he had faced, the battles he had fought, and the lessons he had learned along the way. He knew that the journey wasn't over, but for the first time in a long while, he felt a sense of peace. He had proven himself, not just to others, but to himself. He had faced adversity with grace and resilience, and he had emerged stronger for it. And now he was ready to face whatever came next, armed with the knowledge that he was more than the sum of his experiences, more than the assumptions others made about him. He was Dr. Aaron Blake, a healer, a leader, and a symbol of what it meant to persevere in the face of prejudice. Aaron left the hospital that evening, walking out into the crisp autumn air with a renewed sense of purpose. He wasn't sure what the future held, but he knew that he was ready for it. He had faced one of the hardest trials of his life, and he had come through it not just intact, but transformed. And with each step he took, he carried with him the lessons of the past, the support of his friends, and the unshakable belief that change was not just possible, it was inevitable.